Another day, I wonder if this will go all the way through dirt track trail. This one apparently is the route of an old Roman road, if my rather crude Spanish understanding is correct. It looked a bit not great because there was a sign saying road closed, but that was 5 kilometres back. It was just a local village road, so I just went around that. But hopefully we'll get through. It's very pretty. Woodland, gorge, river running alongside it.
So day 7 of my 22-day trip around northern Spain sees me waking up in this town of Fabio and heading towards Las Medulas. So I come up to Fabio because I had been hoping to visit the Celtic forts that are about 30 kilometres above it, but if you watched yesterday's video you'll know things went quite badly wrong, and instead I ended up wandering around in woodland and swamp off-road before I eventually found my way here. Today we're heading back down south again, and this was deliberately scripted as a pretty soft day because I've done quite a long distance on the previous 6 days, and I'm heading for Las Medulas, which is the site of the largest Roman era gold mine and also the largest open cast mine that they had. It's a spectacular landscape caused by huge destruction about 1900 years ago. So we start off with a scare on this one, yet another closed road, and I thought initially this was the road I'd intend to take, but fortunately after looking at a map I realised no, it was only local roadworks on that particular village street, so I could just go around it. So, Las Medulas, that's what we're heading towards, and basically today's story in terms of the journey is really going back a little over 2,000 years to Roman times, because this was the site of the Roman Cantabrian War. I'm going to connect here to a Roman road that runs down a gorge. I'm not 100% sure that's open. It's a greenway walking trail, and with some of these, as we found to my course yesterday, they're no longer really open at all. But this one I hoped would be open and would give me a nice gorge cycle to get me to much more nearer to my destination. Fortunately, this is indeed how it turned out to be the case, so quite quickly we hit this rough road, but it is actually pretty beautiful going down through a gorge. There's a river here into the right hand side that will turn over, and pretty spectacular. Anyway, back to our story for today. A little over 2,000 years ago, this was the last part of Spain that the Romans had not yet conquered. They probably knew there was a really big gold mine here, and the people living here were the Asturias, and further over to the east, the Cantabri. So basically, in what was called the Cantabrian War, which took about 10 decades to fight, the Romans had to deploy no fewer than 7 legions and a naval squadron. It's estimated about 80,000 men, and the emperor had to arrive, Emperor Augustus. Before they could successfully put down this war. Now, it's telling that one of the first places they captured by its name was probably the Las Medulas gold mining region. That was probably the main goal. But the Asturias and the Cantabri were very good at fighting guerrilla warfare, making use of the terrain in the mountains and ambushing the Romans. So it took this very long period of time, about a decade, for the Romans to actually win a victory. In the course of that war and towards the end of it, most of the warriors fighting them died. Either they were executed by the Romans, who were not taking prisoners, or they killed themselves rather than becoming prisoners themselves. The gold mines themselves, I'll talk a little bit more about them when we get down there, but they probably had a labour force of 50 to 60,000 people, which would be quite similar to the size of the Celtic armies fighting the Romans at this stage. And it's a little bit unclear as to whether they were simply slave labour or whether they were some sort of bonded labour. If you're looking at this route thinking it's pretty rough, you're not wrong. In fact, it's part of a long-distance mountain biking route that covers 400 kilometres. It's called something like Tourist Mountain Bike Routes Through the Mining Basins of of Castile and Leon, which is not exactly very catchy, and this is one of the offshoots of that route. I think they say something like 70% of it is through forests. It's mostly following this sort of rough track, but then some of it is on secondary roads. I wasn't aware of this, in fact, until I got to that sign we've just seen, and that's actually at the other end of this track. I just moved it forward in the video as an exclamation point. But yeah, it's certainly quite spectacular. Rough track. My bike was only just about able to handle it. This was quite slow going.
Well now, this is slightly impressive, isn't it? Hopefully the road goes through the other end. That's all that could go wrong. Yeah, I mean, I can imagine maybe there's been a rock slide, but hopefully not.
Now, I have spent a little bit of time trying to find additional information to tell you about this route, but in fact there is almost nothing. There's that sign, and then that sign led me to a web page that talks mostly about the other 400 kilometres and only mentions this particular offshoot of it in passing. You do see this a fair bit in Ireland as well, to be honest, where there'll be some tourist board sign that probably came out of a meeting 30 years previously and hasn't been updated since, and in particular doesn't have information online. But there's a couple of very, very pretty villages on this, and I mean the total length down from Fabio is probably about 40 kilometres before, well no, about 35 kilometres before I stopped for lunch. But the whole thing is very pretty. I mean, this gorge bit in particular, obviously, but also we're going to come out from this in a minute into vineyards, and then into some sort of low density agricultural land until we get to our next point, which is actually where we're once again going to be crossing the Camino, and I'll be stopping for lunch. So as we continue to cycle through the lands of the Aorus, they were thought to be here from the 3rd century, possibly having come from somewhere around the region of Hungary. They were matrilineal, property was passed down through women, and apparently the warrior class included women as well as men. They were sometimes described as hunter-gatherers, but they also seem to have been pastoralists, i.e. with cattle, sheep, and horses, but quite a lot of the routine food came from collecting and processing acorns to make a sort of bread. They'd fought Rome initially with the Carthaginians as part of I think they were the Punic Wars. And then they'd been mercenaries hired out. So when Augustus was trying to subjugate this final part of Spain, the leaders of the Aorus were people who had fought as mercenaries against the Romans, and I think also probably with them in various other campaigns. They did actually outlast the Roman Empire. I mean, they were pretty badly conquered in that war just 10 years before Common Era, with a lot of the warrior class being killed in the aftermath. Now we've reached some of the vineyards, so we're getting more into the agricultural region. But in fact, that wasn't the end of the story. There were more insurrections in the 100 years that followed, and really, in fact, they remain as a distinct entity up to the time of the Visigoths in the 10th century. So in other words, outlasting the Roman Empire. And quite a lot of the place names and town names in the region still reflect that culture, including, and this will be familiar enough to people from Ireland, the name Lug turning up, Lunasa in Ireland, of course, which is the sun god. So there we go, point in common. And now we're reaching the town and lunch. And an excellent lunch it was too. So I had two things I was nervous about the previous day. The first was whether or not that mountain bike trek Roman road we just came down would actually prove to be passable. It was, and it was really worth doing. A risk definitely worth taking. The second thing we're approaching now, and that is when I had created the route, I hadn't really looked at this second section getting down to the old Roman gold mines in much detail, and I hadn't realised that what it was going to involve was crossing some mountainous terrain with some very deep gorges, and as a result there's really only one road that runs across those gorges, and that is the N120. And as anyone who's done a lot of cycling will know, whenever you get somewhere where there's just one road that crosses an area, that road is going to be very, very busy. So it's not quite a motorway, but once I get on it, you'll see it does look quite like it. So that when I was on the approach to it and coming through this town here just beforehand, I was getting increasingly nervous and wondering just what this was going to be like. Now, as it happens, the camera battery cut out on me while I was actually on the side of the N120, so I did not replace the battery. So all we're going to have is the first, I'd say, 400 to 500 meters. But yep, we are talking about a very busy road with a lot of very heavy lorries on it. We're just approaching the entrance to it now. If you want to see what that road looks like in more detail, I do have all my footage coming back, because in fact I have to retrace this route tomorrow morning to get back on the route going west over to Santiago. So yeah, this little brief section though will give you a sense of just what it was like. There was about 6 kilometers of this, very busy. Coming off that, battery's now died. I'm now 5 kilometers further down the road. A steep climb up a busy enough road. This is another national road. I think it's got 4 numbers rather than 3 though, so it's not quite so busy. So another pretty steep climb up to the ridge above it, and then a final descent down into the terrain that made up Las Medulas. So let's talk about that terrain in a little bit more detail, because it's kind of fascinating. So basically, you're going back to about 2,000 years ago. The Romans know that there's gold in the mountains, and they're desperate to extract it. The problem is the gold is not at a very great concentration. It's not in big thick veins, so normal mining techniques of basically slaves with pickaxes aren't quite going to do the job. So what they did was they came up with this technique that they called mountain destruction. Because that's exactly what it was. And what they did was they created aqueducts and canals, at least 7 of them, bringing the water from all the surrounding regions into the region of Las Medulas. They had multiple reservoirs that stored very large quantities of water there, and then I don't think it's exactly known how they did it precisely, but what they basically did was they unleashed these absolutely vast volumes of water at the mountains, and quite literally demolished the mountains through that water flow. And then they sieved all that out. So this happened over an area of I think it's at least a couple of square kilometers. So you're talking about really, really big destruction of mountains, and left this cliffscape of what was left of the mountains afterwards, which are basically all these red mud appearing cliffs. It also left fairly big delta outflows of the silt that have now become quite fertile agriculturally a couple of thousand years later, and the mines operated like that for, I think it's about 100 years, maybe 200 years. With the labour force that's thought to be in the region of 60,000 people. So you're talking about an absolutely enormous operation. But despite all that, they think they only extracted about £10,000 of gold. Now, £10,000 of gold is not an insignificant amount of gold in today's money, or in money back then. If you found £10,000 of gold, you wouldn't have to worry about working anymore. But I think the actual relatively small volume of gold extracted, in contrast with the huge devastation the Romans caused, and the very large workforce of slave labourers or near slave labourers they employed to extract it, is telling a story in itself about what the Roman Empire was really about. I think, because they left lots of pretty buildings behind, people are often quite uncritical of the Roman Empire and other empires of its type, but they were basically huge slave societies. Here we arrive at my hotel for the night. it was excellent, good value, great view from my balcony here over the mountain range, and fortunately they were also doing food. I think that's tripe. That was the night I went for tripe, and then afterwards taking a walk up towards the remains of the ruins. So the modern small village town of Las Medulas is basically a tourist town that is in the ruins, the remains of these Roman mines, but nowadays they're covered in vegetation. There's oak forest, apparently there's wild boar. I fortunately didn't run into any when I was wandering around, and it's really this quite spectacular red landscape that's become a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The sound of the cuckoo there in the background, which I had heard in Connemara in just a couple of weeks previously. This brings to an end day 7. Do give me a thumbs up if you liked the video, and give the channel a follow. If you want to follow these adventures live in future as I do them, then give my Instagram account a follow. That's eBike Touring Life. And check out the video description for some more links and information on this trip today. Hopefully it will inspire you, and someday I will see you on the road.